It was a moonless night, one of those where the road seems to stretch endlessly, an infinite expanse of dark asphalt that felt like it led nowhere. The truck driver, already weary from his journey, decided to stop for a while. He found a secluded spot by the river, where the silence was so thick it seemed to suffocate the world. The only sound was the steady, soothing murmur of the flowing water. With the truck's engine turned off, he leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes, and let his mind drift, thinking about tomorrow. But the rest would be brief, fleeting. What seemed like a peaceful pause would soon turn into something he would never forget. At first, the sound didn't seem menacing. A faint noise like something heavy being dragged by the current. The kind of sound you could easily ignore. But as time passed, it grew steadily and unnervingly louder. The sound was relentless, like something, or someone, was coming closer, but at its own slow, deliberate pace. It was almost as though whatever it was wasn't in a hurry. Fear began to take root in his mind, but he pushed it away, convincing himself that it was nothing. It's just the wind, he thought, desperately trying to dismiss the growing terror creeping through his chest. The water, in its apparent tranquility, began to take on a new tone. The gentle lapping of the river now seemed almost deliberate, a sound that clawed at his soul, each ripple like an unseen hand pulling at his sanity. He shifted uneasily in his seat but kept his eyes shut, unwilling to confront whatever was happening. His body seemed to resist rest, a tension in the air around him that made his skin crawl. He could hear the sound, and with every passing moment, his heart beat faster. The water had transformed, no longer a calm, peaceful flow, but an ominous force, carrying with it the promise of something terrible, something unnatural. Suddenly, he realized he wasn't alone. The quiet of the landscape had dissipated, replaced by an unnatural stillness that swallowed the night. Something was out there, on the other side of the river, watching him. The sense of being observed grew so powerful that he could almost feel the weight of their gaze pressing down on him. The night, once calm and familiar, had shifted into a nightmare, and he had no idea what was happening, or how to stop it. His heart thundered in his chest as he opened his eyes slowly, the air around him thick with a strange, suffocating energy. For a moment, he thought it might be a trick of the mind, a figment of his imagination. But when his gaze fixed on the far bank of the river, he froze. There, standing motionless like statues, were a group of men. No movement, no sound, just their dark, unmoving figures. They were simply there, staring at him with eyes that seemed to pierce the very core of his being. The fear gripped him instantly, cold and suffocating. The sight of them made no sense, yet it felt as if they had always been there, part of the night itself. Their stillness was unnatural, impossible even, and it radiated a sense of malevolence that chilled him to the bone. They were dressed plainly, but what truly terrified him was how they neither moved nor breathed. They were frozen in time, as though they existed solely for the purpose of watching him. The only movement in the scene was the river's current, flowing between him and the group of shadowy figures. Desperation gripped him, and in an instinctive reaction he blinked, hoping it was all just a bad dream. But when he opened his eyes, they were still there, their unblinking gazes fixed on him. The silence, thick and suffocating, screamed louder than any words ever could. The men were farther away now, at least that's what it seemed. Every time he looked, they appeared more distant, as though something was pulling them away from him, yet they made no motion. It was a distortion of space and time that he couldn't explain, but it felt as real as the terror clutching his chest. Then, one of the men raised a hand and pointed at him. The gesture, so simple, so innocent, sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't just a sign of acknowledgement, it was a threat, an unspoken command that rang louder than any spoken words. His breath hitched, and his eyes darted to the steering wheel, the overwhelming urge to escape surging through him. He couldn't understand what was happening, but everything in him screamed to flee. The fear that gripped him was now so deep that it felt like it had become part of him. His hands, trembling, tightened around the wheel, his body instinctively bracing for flight. The men, however, did not move. One of them, the one who had pointed, took a single step forward. His mouth moved, but the words were lost to the wind. No matter how hard the driver tried to hear, there was nothing. No sound, no voice, just the motion of the man's lips, an act that seemed to stretch reality itself. What was he saying? Why couldn't he hear it? Panic began to spread through him, uncontrolled and suffocating. The figures remained motionless, yet they seemed to advance without moving. Their feet never touched the ground, and there was no sound, no rustle of fabric, no breath. The very air around them seemed to vibrate with an energy that was impossible to understand, and the dread that clung to him felt more tangible than ever. Each figure was like a shadow, silent, relentless, and cold, closing in on him step by step without even a hint of movement. His eyes darted to the truck's engine, his mind racing with a single thought: get out. But his body was paralyzed. It was as though the very air around him had conspired to freeze him in place, to stop him from acting. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and the figures, those silent, watching figures, were getting closer. His body screamed for action, but fear was his only companion. The truck's engine roared to life, breaking the terrifying silence. The sound was deafening, and for a moment, it felt like the last line of defense between him and whatever was out there. He slammed the accelerator, and the truck lurched forward, tearing down the road, desperate to escape the nightmare. But no matter how fast he drove, no matter how far he went, the feeling of those eyes, those unseen presences, never left him. They were still out there watching. The truck sped down the road, but the fear inside him remained, growing with every passing mile. His mind fought to make sense of what had happened, to rationalize the unexplainable, but there was no explanation. The figures, the river, the strange, silent terror, they were all part of him now. And no matter how fast he drove, they would never let him go. As he sped into the night, his mind wandered back to that moment, to the figures standing motionless by the river. The question that haunted him was simple, yet it never found an answer. What had really happened that night? Was it a nightmare? Or was there something darker at play, something that still lingered in the shadows, watching and waiting? The river, the men, the silence, it would follow him forever. And though the truck sped further away, leaving the scene behind, one thing was certain: he would never forget that night. He couldn't. In the rearview mirror, as the miles passed, he thought he saw something moving. A shadow, perhaps, just at the edge of his vision. But when he looked again, everything was empty. Empty, yet somehow not. And you, what do you think? What really happened that night? Who were those men? Have you ever felt the gaze of something you couldn't see? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notifications, and keep following more stories that will challenge your perception of reality. After all, fear might be closer than you think.